and welcome to this episode of the Cold Start Corner Experts Edition. I'm Eric Matei, joined by the one and only Ali Oromchian of Dental Medical Counsel. And Ali's joining me here today to have a conversation all about navigating the legal side of cold starting or purchasing an optometry practice. Ali, how are you, man? It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm well. Thanks for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And look, I know we have a ton to get into. You know, we were kind of talking about the state of things right now, and such an exciting time for so many emerging practice owners to get out there and cold start practices, purchase practices. And I know we have a lot to unpack here. So what do you say we jump right into it?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So starting, look, top of the list, and I know this is a loaded question. It's a loaded question, but I mean,
Sure.
what is the role of legal for new practice owners?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, obviously, there's the legal negotiations, the document reviews, all of that. But I think the role of a lawyer and what I think separates us, from everyone else, and what I've done sort of purposefully is to really be a counselor, right? To be an advisor, to be a psychologist, to be all those things as a young, eye care professional starting down this career path, because it is full of emotion, right? It's full of emotion. And you don't want a lawyer who's just reading the contracts. Anybody can just read the contracts for you. It's really to be an advisor through the whole process and to look at things and say, you know what? Yeah, yes, this is to the landlord's advantage, but here's how we're going to, deal with that. Or this is how important this may be in real practice, things that you don't get by just reviewing a contract. And so, I think having someone that is, eye care specific, that can hold your hand through it and then really give you practical advice on top of really strong legal advice is really what a good, lawyer should be doing.
Yeah. So let's jump into it. Let's start to kind of peel this back, right? Because as you know, we work with doctors across the country, all at different stages of the practice life cycle. And, I think oftentimes it may be overlooked exactly what the legal needs are for that brand new practice. So why don't you kind of help walk us through there, and really let's put ourselves in the shoes of, well, at least some of the clients that we've had the pleasure of getting the opportunity to collaborate and working with, so someone who is, we'll start with someone looking to cold start a practice. So walk through those legal considerations for someone who's cold starting the optometry practice.
Sure, of course. So step one is to find a commercial real estate broker to help find a space and negotiate what we call the letter of intent. Okay. Now, regardless of who is doing, who is your commercial broker, you should never sign a letter of intent without letting, a lawyer, specific, to optometry and ophthalmology or whatnot, review it. Because there are things that a commercial broker will keep in mind and implement and put in there, but there may be things missing that your lawyer wants you to have in there for down the road. So the first step is the letter of intent. And I think a lot of young doctors make the mistake of just signing the letter of intent with the hope of, renegotiating some of those terms, Eric, down the road. But as you and I know, when you're doing a cold start, landlords have these letters of intent for a reason, and they don't want to renegotiate those business terms. And so making sure that a lawyer looks at that LOI, a letter of intent, before you sign it and submit it is sort of step one. Once that's done, then the landlord will draft usually a lease for us to review. So the lawyer steps in there and will review the lease and compare it to the letter of intent and make sure everything's in there that should be in there, that was negotiated in the letter of intent, but then also negotiate all the things that need to happen in the actual lease document, which, as you know, and a lot of you who are listening today who will eventually own your own practices will know, your lease is probably the most important document you will ever sign, because it's a 10, 20, 30-year document sometimes where you're stuck with a landlord and you've got to follow their rules and vice versa. And so that lease becomes really important. As we're approaching signing the lease, we'll probably set up your entity. So whether that's setting up a corporation or setting up a LLC. It just depends on what state you're in and which one has the better tax benefits for you. And then once the lease is signed, then a lawyer will typically review a contractor's agreement to make sure that the payments and all the other terms that you're contracting with the person who's building your office is in line with standards, right? You're not paying too early, you're not paying too late, all those things. And then finally, about 2 months before you open, you will help you hire your employees. Usually we recommend HR for Health so that you can get all your new hire documents, you can get your employment manual, you can get payroll set up, you can get all these things set up that are very, optometry and ophthalmology specific so that you can hire your first employees. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're hearing there, Ali, and for our audience out there, right? Even for you brand new practice owners looking to cold start, there's still a lot of legal considerations there, right? And it's particularly going to be around that lease. And I think something that we definitely want to be sure everyone takes away that Ali mentioned. I mean, Ali, y'all are, correct me if I'm wrong, but y'all are rock stars on understanding exactly all the ins and outs of the legality of the lease and even providing guidance on where you can lean in on some of the negotiation. But ultimately, that's where really that realtor is going to come in, because the realtor is going to be the one that's pulling multiple properties to the table so that you can have leverage in the deal. So it's definitely really important to understand the role of legal coming in, and that is to be sure that all the legalese, the legal language of those documents is in order. But working very, very closely with the realtor. From there, then, so go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish your thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just saying, as far as for those cold starting, right? It's about that lease. It's going to be then also about the organization of the business, organization of the practice, legal structure of it. And so Ali's point, it's important to consider not only the tax ramifications, but big time, particularly in optometry, where you may have different states that have different rules and guidelines that require you to incorporate a certain way. And then the third big legal piece is as it pertains to your team and the HR side. And Ali, I recall, I know we had done a webcast together last year, and you had mentioned something that perhaps someone has more legal exposure with employees than they would like a disgruntled patient. Do you remember something along those lines? So the importance of having that HR house in order.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We rarely these days see malpractice cases anymore, in the optometry, world as compared to, HR lawsuits, right? And especially with COVID, that has expedited where we are seeing a ton of HR problems, and they're usually things that are inadvertent, right? They're inadvertent, mistakes and things that are being made. But the reality is that no one who's listening today and has ever gone through an HR course or a real law course when they were in school, and yet you're asked to know all these rules, right? And so HR for Health really kind of simplifies that and makes it clear, how to be compliant without sort of all the stress that comes with it. And the reality is, Eric, as you know, once you do it right up front, it's all good, for the rest of the time. It's just like clear sailing. It's the problems happen when you don't do it right up front and you try to fix it on the fly a year later, 2 years later. Then it's just a lot more problematic. So fixing things up front is or setting things up right up front really doesn't makes life a lot easier.
Absolutely. In so many levels. And right now we're just talking about the legal side, but I know before we went live, we're talking about just other considerations, right? Financial considerations, financial pro forma, really understanding all those forecasts and projections, startup costs, cash flows, basically everything in our world. That's some really far out exciting stuff. And again, right there in the world of things that, well, you don't learn when you're going to optometry school, medical school, what have you, So we were just talking about cold starts. Now let's shift gears and talk about the legal side of purchasing a practice.
Sure.
because this we have some other moving pieces. So why don't you bring us up to speed on, again, for that doctor right now? Heck, perhaps some folks that we've interacted with in the last week, we've had some new folks come to us with some exciting opportunities to purchase practices. So walk us through how to navigate the legal side of purchasing a practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So with purchasing a practice, there's a whole separate part of the transaction that relates to the practice in addition to the lease. And so again, the first step is the letter of intent, right? Is the letter of intent. Now the key there is, instead of using a commercial real estate broker for the practice that you would use for the lease, for the letter of intent, you're using a consultant, an advisor like you, Eric, to help analyze the data, help look at the details of the practice in order to put a strong letter of intent together. Now, usually we get involved a lot earlier in the process there with a practice purchase, because we're working with you, we're working with the doctor to put that letter of intent together, right? Now some people want to skip that part, and I highly discourage that, because one of the reasons we do these letters of intent is because we want the parties to be on the same page about the details, right? How much you're paying for the practice, when you're intending to close, do you want the seller to work back, all those details, right? What's included in the purchase price, are the frames and lenses included, or is that going to be inventory that's paid separately? All those little details need to be in the letter of intent. And with your help, we can construct a really nice letter of intent and submit that to the other side. While we're doing that, and the seller is considering the letter of intent, is a great time to get pre-approved with the banks. We usually recommend 2, maybe 3, but really no more than 3. There's always players that are strong and sometimes not strong at various times of the year. And so, reaching out to us or you, we can kind of guide people to the right lenders that, are having promotions or are doing a good job, at that point in time. And then once the letter of intent gets agreed upon and we, move forward, usually it's the seller's responsibility to put together what's called an asset purchase agreement. That's basically the document that guides the sale of the assets, right? The patient charts, the physical equipment, the leasehold improvements, the goodwill, all of that. So the seller prepares it, and then we, as the buyer's rep, will review that and start negotiating that. If it looks like the deal is going to move forward, right, and things are looking good on our side, on your side, then we incorporate or set up the entity for the doctor by either setting up a corporation or an LLC. And then we negotiate the lease, as we talked about, before, and then we, do the HR components. So the latter half of it is the same as before, but the first part is very different.
Yeah. So now let's drill a little bit deeper, because I know one of these big areas with purchasing a practice also is going to be like the legal due diligence, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the things, particularly in that legal lane, that they should be looking into, prospective buyers should be looking into when doing that legal due diligence? And for viewers out there, we actually have a really great video there in the Cold Start Corner all about the 3 areas of due diligence, that being legal, but additionally financial due diligence and practice management due diligence. So Ali, why don't you share some insights on all these areas of legal due diligence that buyers are going to want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love that you brought up those 3, because we really talk about that everywhere we go. I write about the 3 areas of due diligence because it's such a key portion of being able to buy a practice while minimizing your risk. The legal due diligence really comprises of a couple of things, right? Is, of course, making sure that the asset purchase agreement is negotiated extremely well. There's no liabilities that are being passed on to you as the buyer, that there's no issues that we have to deal with employees. So we look at the employee files and things of that nature. Sometimes, there are big concerns there that we need to deal with. Patient credits are things that we deal with in the purchase agreements. Of course, Eric, we have you guys, do your analysis and run your credit, your reports and whatnot. and that data helps us, in our negotiations with the APA. Of course, there's a lease that we just talked about. Either we try to get an assignment of the current lease, or we try to get a brand new lease. And part of our due diligence is to look at what lease the seller has and decide, okay, is this a good lease? Because maybe it's 20 years old, right? And sometimes these more basic leases from 10, 20, 30 years ago are awesome leases for you as a modern, doctor to have, because they have less rules, right? And so less protections for the landlord. And so in those scenarios, even though those leases may have been typed up on a typewriter, I'm going to say no. It's we want to keep that. Let's just do an addendum and whatnot. And so that's a big part of it. We look and see if the fictitious business name that the practice is using, Eric, is correctly registered with the state and the county. If it is, then we'll obviously transfer that to the buyer. But here's one thing that we do that a lot of doctors don't do, and it always comes back and haunts them later, is we file trademarks for our clients, right? And so we want to protect their name, right? I mean, if you've got a cool name, right, for your practice, especially in the medical field, it's rare to have like a unique name, and people are copycats. You know what I mean? How many like with like the letter I, doc, do we see out there, or things like that? And it's like, no, let's protect that name and make sure no one else copies us, and so anyway, we do a lot of that as well, and that's been really cool, because it just protects your intellectual property and increases the value of the practice.
Absolutely. And I think that's also that's a really good segue into, Ali. Here we've been focusing on navigating this legal side for cold starting and purchasing, and you're bringing up intellectual property and stuff like that. And why don't you share a little bit? Again, seeing as our audience here is presumably on that path, and whoever you are, wherever you are in the process, just keep on trucking. You got good things going on, whether you're cold starting or buying. Just keep on. But that said, Ali, why don't you share a little bit? Hey, let's fast forward, and you're a few years into ownership, right? That lease, right? So we're talking about, like, right now we're getting the lease baked, and it's going to be good for 10 years, right? And right now we're talking about, if we're buying a practice, we're buying a thing, and once it's done, it's done. So these HR considerations. But why don't you fast forward a little bit and just maybe share with our viewers a little bit of what you see some of the legal concerns and objectives are for practices as they are a bit more established. If there's any things on that front. I know you mentioned intellectual property coming into the fold.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're an established practice owner, and whether or not you're growing your existing practice, one location, trying to make it bigger, or if you're trying to do multiple practices and grow from there, there's a couple of things that you have to be aware of. I think there's three things, actually, right? So one is, protecting your intellectual property from theft from employees. So who are the culprits? Usually they're doctor associates, right? So taking patient charts, patient lists, referral sources, those kinds of things. And so what you want to have is, you want to have really strong employment contracts with your doctor associates that make it clear that they can't take your patient lists, they can't take, your referral sources, they can't take, your intellectual property that you've created. Many of you have come up with some really cool things that you do inside your practice that are unique to you in terms of how you market and things of that nature. And all that is, protectable, right? And so that is sort of, I think, step one. Step two would be to protect your marks, right? So what are we talking about? Marks, logos, names, catchy phrases, those kinds of things. Like you guys look on the screen, right? Eric's got the Cold Start Corner trademarked, right? And like that is a big deal, right? I mean, that's a big deal because that's a great name for a podcast, and it's a great name he can use for a lot of different things. But you've got to protect it, right? You've got to protect it. So that so that is sort of what I would do on that front, as you're planning on growing either your current practice or, again, multiple practices. And then the final thing is, as we've talked about, is HR, right? You need an employment manual, an up-to-date employment manual for all your current team members, to protect against a lot of, things, including, HR violations, intellectual property, issues, and various other things. But then two, it limits your liability, right? It limits your liability. Like, the more documentation you have and the more you have on the HR side, the less liability you have as you grow. And remember, the larger you get, the more problems you're going to have, right? And the more liability will come to you. So if you do that, I think those three are, there's a lot of things, but those three are probably the top three.
Yeah. Really, really great stuff. Really great stuff. And by the way, y'all, and Ali's going to be dropping his contact info here before we wrap up. But definitely head on over and you can read a lot more about some stuff. I know Ali, prolific writer, blog, a ton of content there at the Dental and Medical Counsel website. So Ali, I do want to shift us now back. Thank you for lending those insights as far as like, hey, what should you be prepared for in the years to come? So now let's bring it back to where folks are now, right? And as we're kind of entering the last few minutes of this episode, why don't you share some of the big watchouts or disasters you've seen, Ali, right? Because I know we were talking previously offline regarding each of us getting radical things crossing us coming into our organizations. So why don't you share just like some of the things that you just kind of want to maybe leave our viewers with a list of things like definitely don't do this.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Do you have another 30 minutes to go through all? No, here's what I would say. And before I go through some of those things, I want to make, I think, a general comment. And I know, Eric, you believe in this wholeheartedly, and this is one of the reasons why you and I, work so closely together and so aligned on many things. But at the end of the day, I think everyone who's listening should know that the only path you have to financial independence as a doctor is through practice ownership. Okay. You cannot reach those working for someone else, as a doctor, right? As a doctor. And so, if you're an engineer, totally different scenario, right? You go work for Google or Apple or whatever, you get some stock and you can love life. But as a doctor, to get to financial independence, you have to open up your own office. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. It's a lot of work. It's very hard work, but is it unbelievably difficult? Is it impossible? Absolutely not, right? There are literally tens of hundreds of thousands of people, right, who have started their own practice or bought a practice and are very successful. But you have to follow a recipe, right? You have to follow a recipe. And that's where Eric comes into play. It's where I come into play. It's where your CPA is there. It's why the bankers are there. So we know the details of making sure you don't repeat mistakes that others have made, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the difference between having a very successful practice and being successful in practice ownership and having a really hard time comes down to the little things, right? It comes down to the little things.
Absolutely.
And and those little things are the things, and Eric, and this, are the things that a lot of people overlook because they go, oh, look, it's a little thing, like maybe it's not a big deal. But guys, it's a huge deal. So let me give you an example. You go with a bank, okay, that has, let's say, a 5-year prepayment penalty, right? And let's say that, you just ignore that because you're like, oh man, I love my interest rate. I'm never going to change. Well, that could haunt you in 5 years, right? Because one, interest rates could fall. Two, God forbid, you might get hurt or disabled or something and you have to sell the practice, or you have to do something else. Or you may have to pay it off to maybe buy a building, some exciting things. And so you want to start to negotiate some of those. Now, you can't get rid of prepayment penalties, because they're always going to be there, but you want to kind of be watchful of them and try to minimize them, right? Another thing is not really knowing how to read your financial statements, right? Not knowing what a balance sheet is, a P&L. Now, those are not easy, but with the help of your CPA and Eric and other advisors, you can figure that out. From a legal portion, I would say number one, I sound like a broken record, Eric, but number one is ignoring your HR, right? Ignoring your HR is going to be your number one regret, because it will come back to haunt you. So get hooked up with HR for Health and just do it right from day one. Number two is, I would say, something that I just recently saw with a couple clients is, don't trust your landlord. Don't trust other people who just put contracts in front of you and say, hey, just sign this, or it's a standard contract. I mean, Eric, I have a heartbreaking story with a doctor, an ophthalmologist actually recently, who had a 10-year lease, was in year 6 of the lease. Okay. And so, 4 years left, right? And outgrowing the space, wanting to move to a bigger space, right? So super excited. The landlord comes and says, hey, I have a big space right here. And you can move into that, and we'll give you some breaks and some tenant improvement dollars. They put a lease addendum in front of him, right, that terminated his existing lease and gave him 6 months to move into the new space. If he didn't,
wow,
he was in breach of his lease. So he went, and so this doctor signed it because the landlord basically said, hey, this is standard, this is what we talked about, but totally different than what they talked about. And so obviously it takes way more than 6 months to build a space. He had to get lender approval. He had to do all this stuff. I mean, it's a total mess. So, I mean, it sounds like an extreme example, but you and I both know those are not extreme. It happens all the time.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're listening, if you're a doctor listening to this, you're like, oh my gosh, that would never happen to me. Yes, it can happen to you, right? Because in the moment, you're feeling rushed and you're busy and this and that. So what I would say is, one big piece of advice is just take a step back. If somebody puts a contract in front of you, and contact me or Eric or someone you trust and say, hey, just raise your hand and ask for help. Say, hey guys, can you just take a look at this? Like, what should I do? And then deal with it there. So
yeah, absolutely. And man, look, Ali, I know that is only the tip of the iceberg of probably droves of stories you can share. Yeah. Man, this has been a fascinating time, and I feel like we could go another half hour. We can keep going, right?
Totally.
We could do a day-long session, which, by the way, Ali, I do like that idea of maybe doing a session that's all around transitions and what have you.
I would love that. So, we should definitely do that. Yeah.
So to wrap things up again, Ali, this has been absolutely amazing, this conversation today about navigating the legal side of cold starting or purchasing a practice. Thank you on behalf of our team at Akrinos and all of our viewers out there. Thank you for the insights. As we're kind of wrapping things up, how can folks connect with you and continue the conversation and see where things go from there?
Yeah. I mean, any 3 ways is probably easy. You can call my office. The number is 925-999-8200. And you can schedule a time with my scheduling coordinator, and she'll get you on the calendar quickly. You can always email me as well. My email is pretty simple. It's just my initials, AO, and then DM Counsel, and that's COUNSEL.com. And I'm sure we can put all this in the show notes and stuff. But either of those 2 ways are easy to follow up with us. You can go to the website. I think Eric just put it up on the screen and get more info. I write a lot, as Eric mentioned, so there's a lot of awesome content in there. And there might be stuff there that's not exactly related to you, but you might find it useful. But just remember, all the medical specialties in many ways are the same when it comes to starting a practice or buying a practice. So read it. If it's not optometry or ophthalmology related, it might be vet or dental or medical. Read those too if you find them useful. So.
Yeah. Well, Ali, man, thank you so much for joining us here on
Thank
the
you,
Cold
Eric.
Star Corner. This has been great. To all of our viewers out there, if you found this valuable, as I'm sure you did, right? I had Ali Oromchian, Dental Medical Counsel, joining us to have this conversation around navigating the legal side of cold starting or purchasing your optometry practice. So if you're looking for more great tips like this, no matter where you are in that process, you can find it all at the Cold Star Corner at Akrinos.com. Ali, again, man, thank you so much. Keep doing amazing things, helping doctors coast to coast bring their vision to reality. And on behalf of all of us here at Akrinos, Eric Matei signing off.